everyone, it's Pastor Brenda. Glad to have you here with us. Gather your roommates, your family, your small group. Really glad to have you here as we continue on in our How to Read the Bible conversation. As we said every week, this is the theme. The Bible is living and active, and it's not going anywhere. And as we've learned from our conversations when we meet together as a church, hopefully you are learning this from each other, how this Bible shapes us and forms us like in ways we never considered. We see this living and active all the time, and we're going to do that again one more time tonight. And we got more weeks to come, but tonight it's going to be all about the epistles. And do not be surprised that you will never read the epistles the same again. All right, so here we go. How to read the epistles. The word epistles, which is a church word, is actually a Greek word, and all it means is letters. So when we're reading the epistles, we're actually reading other people's mail. Just as simple as that. And maybe this is one of the reasons why we like those books in the Bible so much, because they're written to people. Maybe those people they're written to are to us also, like we feel included. We as a church just finished reading the Gospels. We did a 40-day Gospel reading plan together, and the Gospels are great, but they don't teach us like how to live out your faith stuff that the epistles do. That other people's mail has given us this great discourse, this great wisdom of how to live out this faith. This is why the epistles have some of the most Instagrammable quotes ever. These Bible verses that just mean so much, because they are written from real people to real people, discussing the life of Jesus, the way of Jesus, and how we are to go now in our faith. So this is why we love them so much. But let me begin, because we're talking about letter writing, right? Some facts about the letter writing of the first century. So this is not just the church. This is the first century overall. In all of the first century letters, Paul wrote the longest letters by far. So of all the private letters preserved from Greco-Roman antiquity, there are 14,000 about. The average length is 87 words. The shortest letter is 18 words, and the longest is 209 words. Now, the letters that they have preserved are most often written to one person, a single person, while Paul wrote to a whole church. There are two men, Cicero and Seneca, who wrote most of the letters that are preserved in antiquity. And that's just because they're uber wealthy, and they wrote lots of letters. The letters were typically written on one papyrus sheet, and they were very expensive. This was for the more wealthier people. So Cicero and Seneca wrote the longer letters, again, uber wealthy. The shortest that was written was 22 words, and the longest was 2,500 words. So for Paul, now I can assume of his high educated background is why he was a letter writer, why he chose this way to communicate to the other churches and all the churches that he traveled to, visited and was discipling, why he chose this. But he also must have had some money to do this expensive practice, because he wrote a lot of letters. So Paul's shortest letter was 335 words, and his longest was 7,100 words. His average length for Paul is 2,495, which is 2.5 times longer than the longest letter in all the writers of the ancient world. So question, which one of Paul's letters is the shortest and which one is the longest? This is for your Bible trivia nerds. Shout your answers out right now. All right, so if you didn't know, if you need the answer, Philemon is the shortest letter at 335 words, and the longest is the book of Romans at 7,100 words. And Romans is 16 chapters, is a long book. A little trivia for you guys. We have the epistles, which make up from the book of Romans all the way to the book of Jude. And Paul's letters are the ones that begin first. Then we got the Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude. So these are all other writers: Peter, Jude, James, John. And then Paul wrote this first letter. So Romans to Philemon are right there. They are in order in the Bible by their length. Romans is the longest book. Philemon is the shortest book. And every book in between is just getting shorter and shorter and shorter. I don't know why they did that. Just a little interesting trivia to help you appreciate this living and active Bible. So, Paul had a lot to say, right? Let's get back on track. Scribes were often hired to write these letters because they had the ability to write small. Thus, the smaller they could write on the one papyrus sheet, the more the words they could get down on this expensive way to write. So Paul didn't write these letters alone. He had people with him in the room writing them. So let's consider it like this. It's not like Paul sat down by candlelight and just was writing letters to his long-lost loved churches. He would hire a scribe who could write small, and then Paul would dictate. But he also probably had his co-laborers with him. That's what he called them, the leaders of the churches, the Christians, the people he knew and loved. And they would just be together, and Paul would be like, what should I say? And they would kind of collaborate or collaborate on what was going to happen. And then Paul would write, but it would be his words, but would be an input from these co-laborers, and that would become what was written. So when in Romans 16, 21 through 22, which is the end of the very long book, it was written on the scroll, whatever. Timothy, my fellow worker, sends you his greetings, as do Lucius, Jason, Sosipater, and my fellow Jews. I, Tertius, the one writing this letter for Paul, send my greetings too, as one of the Lord's followers. So you can see this was the group that gathered around to help write the book of Romans. It says in Galatians 6:11, notice what large letters I used to write these closing words in my own handwriting. So I'm guessing they had this discussion, put together the letter to the Galatians, and at the end of the papyrus, there was some extra space, and Paul was like, no, let me sign this with my big, fat signature, because there was extra space on the papyrus maybe. All right? Now, when Paul wrote these letters, he didn't retell the stories of Jesus or of the prophets or any of the Psalms or the poetry in the Bible, because he assumed that his hearers or the readers of this letter would already know the stuff. I mean, for sure they would know the Hebrew Bible, and for sure they would know the life of Jesus, because this would be first century Christians. They would have had seen some firsthand or have heard the stories firsthand or maybe secondhand of the stories of Jesus. So he didn't waste any space to retell the story of Jesus or to retell some of the prophecy out of Isaiah, for example. He just went into this beautiful theological discourse to help us think through what the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus means to us and how this grows our faith. So, the other big thing about the epistles is the Sermon on the Mount, which is the quintessential, profound, the much respected teaching of Jesus, is really weaved throughout all of the epistles. But again, they didn't repeat what Jesus said or taught to save space on that papyrus. So this is interesting. When you read your epistles or the letters in the future, do it with a window to look for this thread of the Sermon on the Mount. Where did this come from? In Matthew 5 through 7 is the recording of that. Where did Jesus say this so that Paul said this? Or where did Jesus say this so that John said this? Just have fun with that thread, because it's really there, but they just didn't repeat it because they had to save space because it was so expensive. And Paul just kept writing and writing and writing these long letters. And then one more interesting fact is the book of Romans is the longest letter. It was probably only read by about 200 people. I mean, Rome was a very large city at the time, right? The whole Greek Roman dynasty. And there are several churches there. So he wrote this one letter, and it got transferred around to the different churches to be read, but maybe only 200 people. Like all that work, all that expense, all that thought for about 200 people. That's wonderful. So let's experience what this would have been like. And to have this experience, I'm going to clip in here a practice, something that we did together as a church on the Friday nights that we meet. So we did this live, we meet through Zoom. We did this live through Zoom. So I'm just going to have this part put in and just get a feel of what happened. Here we go. So let's experience this. I'm going to have my co-laborer, Catherine, join me here on the couch. Okay? She's my co-laborer in Christ. And I am going to write a letter or an epistle to Steve. So what would happen is we would have this group think, and then the person who would go to Steve, like we didn't have Zoom back in the first century, right? The person would then take the letter and go to the church or go to Steve to present this letter. And then Steve would accept the letter and then hand it back to Catherine and say, please perform this for me, which is basically you just saying, please read this out loud to me. So Steve, ask Catherine to perform this letter for you.
Catherine, would you please perform that letter for me?
All right. So, for example, Phoebe was the one that took the letter to the Romans church and spread it around, and this was going on. So this is just it. So, Catherine, please read to everyone the letter from Brenda to Steve. Yes, you can.
Dear Steve, I commend Catherine as my coworker in faith. Receive her as you would me. We continue in our daily work to power under people with love. There was just a situation the other day when someone came at me and I so wanted to power over and stand in my rightness of the situation. But I decided after some long thinking that I being right was less important than the other person being heard. This continues to be a struggle, but I am encouraged from our conversations together to persevere on. I think back to those lessons we learned from Don Myers and am encouraged. Though my grades were better than yours, I do think that we both learned a lot that we are still applying to our lives today. Do you remember that time driving around the Arc de Triomphe roundabout in Paris and the decision we had to make? They had to be quick and wise. It is a good thing you had years of knowledge to see us through. It is in such conversations and such experiences that we encourage each other's faith to grow. May we continue to listen to our podcasts, have such conversations, have such life experiences, and be an encouragement to each other. How many times do we quote Boyd to each other? Soon we will be able to meet in Bistro Le Hermitage again to make our
Yes.
plans to express our faith through love. To be the salt of the earth and the light of the world that cannot be hidden. To not power over in love, but to remove the log from our own eyes and not focus on the speck in each other's eye. I particularly will like helping you remove that log from your own eye. We will talk more about it then. My grace and peace be with you, John, Jamon, Xavier, and Jada. Send their blessings to Brenda.
So Steve, yes or no question. In reading this, was anything unclear to you?
No. Well,
Hey,
there was
pause.
one thing I got wrong. I'm not so sure your grades were better than mine.
Okay, Catherine, what was unclear to you? And you can, if you want to reread it back to everybody and kind of point out what was unclear, you're free to do that. But what was unclear to you?
You're talking about, not powering over even when you want to, and then old situations that Did Steve get you into them, or did you and him get into them?
We'll tell you in a moment.
That's one question. That you were a better student. That
Oh, come on. All right. Now, to be fair, I wanted Catherine to be set up with this because this is so much fun, isn't it? To be fair, as Catherine was my co-laborer, she would have been in on the writing of this. And so she would have gone, and if Steve had any questions, she would have known because we would have been talking about it, and Steve could have asked questions about it. But of course, because this is our conversation, this is the one side of our conversation, Steve might not have. But then what happens is Catherine would have become a teacher of this. So as Phoebe went to the Roman churches with Paul's letter, if they had questions about this conversation, Phoebe would then be able to answer these questions, and they would have conversations in church, just like here. From this letter that Paul wrote. So it was a one-sided letter, but Phoebe would be the one in doing it. So for the rest of you being a part of the church, anybody can pipe in what was unclear to you if you had received this letter. Zoom first. Or anybody want to pipe in what was what was unclear to you?
Did everybody understand the Arch to Triumph thing?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, I have an inkling about maybe what I think it was about, but I don't really actually know. Yeah.
Right. We'll tell that story in a bit. Anything else unclear?
There was a name in there in that boy that I didn't recognize.
Don Myers?
Yeah.
Was that a professor? One of your professors?
Using context clues, as our teachers tell us. Yes, you can. If the context clues will tell you that was a professor. Everything in this letter.
Camera.
Everything in this letter, you could do an archaeological dig on. Steve's in my life and find everything to be true. Particularly, in Google days here.
particularly the grades.
You can do an archaeological dig and find our grades. That would be a dig. I'm not sure where mine are.
Archived.
Any other things that were not clear in this letter?
I mean,
Yeah.
My question, I think, would be when it was written. There wasn't a date. I mean, it's assumed that she's bringing it to him after you've written it with her. But was it weeks, months, years later? How long did it take to get the letter delivered?
And some person not knowing might wonder, where was college?
Right.
Where did you go up?
mentioned.
Janice, you had one.
There were a number of
The La Hermitage.
personal references. So the Hermitage thing, or meeting up somewhere, I didn't know what that was about.
Yep, that's a restaurant Steve and I love.
Okay.
So for him and I to know where the Bistro La Hermitage, meeting there and having these discussions happens 2-3 times a year for us. For us, not unusual. But for somebody else, reading one side of a conversation could be unusual. Steve, what do you want to say that is clear, funny? What do you want to add about your part of this letter?
it was all really, really good. I think what would, if I'm trying to put a context for everybody else to understand, there were so many things that struck my laughter, my heart, everything that was in the letter, the power over, power under, the Don Myers, an old college professor who used to say, I still remember something that Don Myers used to say all the time: the same sun that hardens clay softens butter. Remember that one, Brenda?
I do.
And it was about how, God's love on some people is like, will harden them, and some people it'll soften them. It was just a really fun concept. But when you said Don Meyer, that's exactly what I thought. So much of this gave me personal context that everybody else kind of got, but for me it really was much deeper, and I really liked that about it. And I'm sure the same thing happened back in the early church, where we're just sometimes trying to guess the context, and the person it was written to probably really struck home. Does that make any sense at all?
So, yeah. So when I wrote in Don Myers, I knew you were going to go there, so I knew
Right.
I didn't need to waste my papyrus sheet to put in that quote, because I knew that would be with the context that you would go to, and your heart would be warmed.
Right.
But for everybody else receiving it, just a name. Right. Jess.
I remembered my other question. So we in this room and on Zoom know who Brenda and Steve are. But if we were just a stranger that walked in from Occoquan Road off the street, we wouldn't know the relationship.
Right. You wouldn't know.
Right.
Yeah.
No power over,
Yeah.
power under. I mean, these are things that Steve has brought to the church, which I emphasize on purpose. But they wouldn't know that at all. So they would be even more outside of the context.
They might think you were trying to be mean by antagonizing him with your previous grades from school.
Catherine's stuck on that.
I hope you had as much fun and got a lot out of it as we did when we did this exercise together. Steve is a friend of mine for 35 years now. We met back in Bible college. If you did an archaeological dig on my life and Steve's life, everything on that letter, you'd be able to prove and find out and understand the depths that were there. But like if you just came off the street, a lot of it you would not understand, right? Like we talked about. And some of the stuff, if you read just part of it and just took this part, you could actually build a whole sermon series and maybe miss the point of what was being written. Like when I talked about us being in the Arch de Triomphe in Paris and going around that roundabout, and I wrote to Steve saying how we had decisions to make. They had to be quick and wise. It's a good thing you had years of knowledge to see us through. Boy, that sentence makes a really good sermon. What does it have to do about driving through the Arch de Triomphe and surviving that 12-lane circle roundabout that is crazy dangerous? But you can see a good sermon coming out of that, right? So some of the epistles have that too, because we're only getting one side of the conversation if we're reading a letter, right? Like getting just like one side of a phone call. So when it's written in 1 Timothy 5:23, and this is Paul writing to Timothy, don't drink only water. You ought to drink a little wine for the sake of your stomach because you are sick so often. This is actually, if you consider it a letter, this is actually a touching moment of Paul saying something kind and thoughtful and caring to this young man, Timothy, he's discipling. This is not about wine and should we drink wine or not, people. This is about a caring sentiment for Timothy to get better so he can continue to do the work. Maybe this will help. Let's read some stuff out of Corinthians, because Corinthians gives us lots of things that gets to be debated and taken out of context. So for example, here, 1 Corinthians 7:29, it says, but let me say this, dear brothers and sisters, the time that remains is very short. So from now on, those with wives should not focus only on their marriage. Like, what does that one sentence mean? You definitely need some context clues to help you with that one. And of course, Corinthians gives you that. It's a rather long book. But context clues are very important to help you interpret what that really odd verse means. And then I'll read also out of 1 Corinthians 14. This is verse 34. Women should be silent during the church meetings. It is not proper for them to speak. They should be submissive, just as the law says. Who's not heard that one before, right? Let me also read to you out of 1 Corinthians 14. So same chapter. We're going to go back up to verse 6. This is what Paul wrote. Dear brothers and sisters, if I should come to you speaking in an unknown language, how would that help you? But if I bring you a revelation of some special knowledge or prophecy or teaching, that will be helpful. Notice, dear brothers and sisters. And then Paul continues on, again in context, to teach how the gifts of the Holy Spirit are for the church and the leadership of the church. dear brothers and sisters. And then he says in verse 34 that women should be quiet. Perhaps, doesn't mean women to be quiet in church, but perhaps Paul is answering a question that the Corinthian church had for him, and he's writing a letter back answering their questions. We know through history that there were at least 4 letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. 2 of those letters have been lost in history. Then we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And what we know of is Paul's first letter and Paul's 3rd letter are lost. So what we have in 1st and 2nd Corinthians are the 2nd and 4th letters. And I would also guess is that the Corinthian church wrote Paul letters first, and Paul answered their questions back, and they had this written correspondence going on. So when we're reading the Corinthians letters, Paul is answering their questions from the Corinthian church. That should give you some context clues to blow your mind, people. And that's what I hope to do, to give you this next beautiful step. God could have given us theological essays that were clear. But other people's mail to the first churches are of value and can speak a divine word to all generations. The Bible writers never got together in one room and said, let's put together one message of what the life of Jesus was all about. No, it was John here and Peter here and Paul here, and here, writing these letters to the church to help them understand the way of Jesus that was happening, to help disciple these young churches, to teach what they've been learning through the Holy Spirit, what Jesus taught them firsthand or secondhand. And they wrote this down in letters for these churches to have and to grow. And then what would happen is someone would read the letters. Phoebe went to Rome and read the letters to the churches in Rome. And if the letter was deemed really good, the churches would then share that letter with another church and then another church. And these letters would either be copied down by scribes and spread to other churches, or if they were just short letters of, hi, how are you? They would not be copied, they would just be lost. Literally, the epistles we have in our Bible came around because they were the ones that went viral. What Paul had to say, or John or Peter or Jude, was so good, the churches copied them down and shared them and passed them around and passed them around and passed them around. And then it came time to about the early 300, 325, 330, 340. This is not very clear, but at some point, the church leaders decided we had to put together a New Testament, and they chose the letters that went viral. The ones that were full of heresy kind of fell off to the side. The letters that were maybe too personal or that just didn't have legs just kind of fell away. And by this later dates, the letters that were chosen were the ones that went viral and one were believed to be Holy Spirit inspired, did not contain heresy, and they were just, bam, considered to be part of this New Testament. That is it. And since then, churches have had this long history of picking and choosing how to grow their church based out of verses in these letters. Sometimes it's been great. They pick a verse and this becomes the foundation for an entire denomination, and it is good. And sometimes it causes a lot of damage. But remember that the Bible is living and active. So a really bad example of this is slave owners picking out the verses about slavery, again, written to first century churches dealing with slavery that was not the modern slavery that we know of today, which still exists, and is not the slavery of 400 years ago that broke America. It's a slavery back in the Greek and Roman times. So they take those verses written in a letter about how to handle slavery and create this whole theology that slavery is biblically correct. This is sin. And too many churches were built on this and kept our brothers and sisters in slavery. But this is the beauty of this Bible, you guys. Because at this very same time that these letters were used to keep our brothers and sisters in bondage and less than the image of God, the same Bible was being used to teach reading to the slaves, where they discovered this living and active act of God, this living and active book. And they came to understand this God of Jesus, this God of Moses, to be true. This is the way. And the same Bible became their lifeline, and their hope and their emancipation was begun because of this same Bible that was twisted by one was the truth by some. Let me just say, there is a documentary on PBS about the history of the Black church that beautifully tells you this story. It is amazing at how the Bible can be read so wrongly and yet be so truthful to change generations of our brothers and sisters' lives. This is this living and active Bible. Another thing we need to look forward to here is when we read these epistles, these letters, we're going to have questions. Well, the thing about questions, and our next lesson is going to be about how to read the Bible with questions, is we don't like to have uncertainty. We want the Bible to be certain. We want to read it so we can know it and know how to live. But when the Bible gives us questions, then we don't know. And we don't like not knowing. So we're going to get to that. But I also want to tie in something that's really important here. Larger Story Church, we're made up of conversations. When we meet together on Zoom, it is intentionally. We're meeting across 3 different time zones, 7 different states, with people who want to have conversations about the Bible. And when we have these conversations, all of a sudden these epistles that we talked about, these letters, I'm getting this thought and Heidi's thought and Jess, and you just saw it in our clip we taped in here about these people offering their wisdom. And all of a sudden this living and active Bible with other people's thoughts, it becomes alive and makes sense. And I can read about Timothy hearing from Paul this great endearment about to have just a little wine so that your stomach feels better. All of a sudden, I'm not reading about should I drink wine or not, but I've learned from other people how tender Paul was in that moment to care about Timothy in that way. That we learned tonight in our conversation about these letters. This is the beauty of it. So this is my closing challenge for you. Take one epistle that you love, and I want you to reread it with this lens of only getting one side of the conversation. That was a letter written to real people, addressed to real people from a real person. And see if that doesn't bring you context, newness, and lead you to some great conversations with your people. Have fun with that. Because this Bible, it is living and active, and it's not going anywhere. Thanks for having this conversation with me, and I will see you next week.